Okay, and now I want to talk about something that I find really interesting, and that's these Trump tariffs. Beginning in March, the Trump administration started putting out a series of tariffs against China. A tariff is a tax put on goods coming in or going out of a nation. So in this case, they were taxes on aluminum and on steel. A 25% steel tax and a 10% aluminum tax. Now, many view this as rectification for a trade imbalance that China has enjoyed with the United States for a long period of time. Likewise, it's also a punitive tax against the Chinese for supporting a government-sponsored hacking program. Now, this hacking program involved hackers unofficially working with the Chinese government who would hack into American companies and organizations, even the United States government, take whatever research, whatever information they could, take whatever designs they would have, any of the patent information. They would then give this stolen information to the Chinese government, who would then distribute it to their chosen Chinese corporations. Now, this was extremely good for Chinese industry, and that it gave them a unique advantage of not needing to do research that the American corporations were doing. Elon Musk actually mentioned that Chinese hacking was the reason why he made all of the designs for any of his products completely open sourced and available for everyone to see. He knew that it was worth more to just put it out there so that people can copy it rather than pay the fee of trying to protect it from Chinese hackers who they knew that they wouldn't be able to stop anyway. Now, this was a wonderful setup for the Chinese, who had corporations that didn't have to do research, who didn't have to do the hard study to make new products, but of course it put American companies at a disadvantage. This tariff on manufacturing, the backbone of the Chinese industry, was viewed as a way of incentivizing the Chinese to put a stop to this behavior, not only of allowing the hackers to do what it is, but to actually stop supporting them in the action. Fast forward to late May, and the push for these tariffs to be extended not only to China but to everywhere has brought a lot of condemnation on the Trump administration. Whereas before, the tariffs would have only targeted China, now they're also targeting Canada, Mexico, and our EU allies. Now, I want to look at this policy from two different standpoints. And that's, first, we need to look at why is it that some people agree with what the president's doing. First off, we need to understand that a tariff is a tax on a product. So it increases the cost of that product to anyone who buys it. So say that you're a manufacturer here in the United States and you want to manufacture a good. You're going to go with the cheapest product. So if you need to make something out of steel, but suddenly that steel becomes 25% more expensive, which it would under these new tariffs, then you're going to go with somewhere else. Most likely now, you're going to be able to go with American steel, which can be produced but doesn't suffer the 25% penalty. That's now going to be a lot cheaper of an option if you are a manufacturer in the United States. The people who would be supportive of such a policy are exactly the people who build products like manufactured steel or aluminum. These are people who feel that they've been undercut by unfair trade practices all across the world, and that they haven't been able to get a fair shake in the industry. This was also a group of people that Donald Trump directly targeted with his Rust Belt campaign to say that, you were people who weren't served by the Democratic Party and you weren't served by the old Republican Party, but I'll take care of you. His targeting of the Rust Belt is exactly what we're looking at. Now, when the government uses its powers to change the economic landscape to benefit its local producers, its local manufacturers, its local industries, what that's called is economic protectionism. It's the government trying to protect its own economy, mostly by putting some sort of pressure on others that makes it harder for them to compete. Now, if you're one of Trump's base, which in a large part represent these former Democratic voting blue states in the Rust Belt, this is exactly what you would want to see. You'd want to see an economic environment that puts America first. And economic protectionism in the form of these tariffs represent exactly that. Now, of course, the policy comes with a lot of criticism, just like anything else that Donald Trump does. However, this one comes from a lot of established conservatives and a lot of actual economic arguments that tariffs are a bad thing, always a bad thing. The best argument is that any tariff, any form of a tariff, whether it appears to be a tax on goods coming in, what it actually is a tax on manufacturers as well. Let's look at manufacturers here in the United States. If you're an automotive manufacturer, you don't actually get cheaper steel or cheaper aluminum through this. You actually have more expensive steel and aluminum because you no longer have the option of getting foreign-made goods, like foreign-made raw materials, at the prices they used to be. Whether it's not quite 25% more expensive, the American steel and aluminum companies will be more expensive than your old options. So if you're a manufacturer, you are suffering a form of a tax regardless, and it's going to be more expensive for you to do business. Now, yes, that might be a good thing for the actual steel and aluminum workers, but for most other manufacturers, it's actually going to be a little bit damaging to their bottom line. Now, second, because of this attack on other economies, namely our allied economies, they have instituted that they will put a series of punitive tariffs against the United States. Now, some of those tariffs include our manufactured goods as well as many of our food products, which America is very good at producing a lot of agricultural products that are used around the world. Now, putting tariffs on those is something that's going to make it very hard for a lot of people going forward. In the bottom line, what these tariffs are going to represent is that it might make a few industries, several very important industries to the United States, much better off, in that it will direct a lot of manufacturing energy towards the steel industry and towards the aluminum industry. Maybe in the future we'll also see similar things with coal or other various raw goods that Donald Trump has targeted in the past. But the long-term economic consequences, we don't know. We don't know. First of all, investment into steel manufacturing or someday coal or other things. These are investments that you need to believe that the price is going to be good for years to come, and even that process is going to be decades long. You're not going to build a steel factory or coal mine when you think that we might only have a decade of this economic environment to go. If a change of presidency or a change of who's in charge of the legislature ends up completely turning these tariffs over, then that's no longer going to be an economic environment. So we might see that there's no new investment in these new industries. That could be a worst case scenario, because then all American manufacturers are paying much more for raw goods when they aren't getting more in supply from the steel manufacturers. In the best case scenario, we could see that so many new jobs and so much new investment is taking place with these steel workers and with the aluminum workers and with all the other raw goods that are affected by this tariff, that it creates an economic boom in the old Rust Belt. On this, I'm kind of pessimistic. I think it might go a little bit closer to the worst case scenario than the better. But in any case, what this will mean is that the American consumer is going to be hurt. Now, that's because no matter what happens, many of our own manufacturers are going to be paying more for their goods, which, depending on the elasticity of whatever the good is, that cost is going to funnel down to the consumer. If they're paying more for their goods to produce a car, then cars are probably going to become more expensive. If they're paying more to produce hammers, then hammers are going to become more expensive. Now, this may be a little bit, it may be a lot, but the American consumer is going to be paying more. That's why this tariff plan is really banking on the Rust Belt doing well as it. Let's hope they're right. Now, but something that I want people to realize is that while a lot of people want to blame Donald Trump for this and Donald Trump's personal philosophy on trade tariffs being a good thing, I don't. I think there's something else going on, and I think that in a rather surprising turn of events, had it been Hillary Clinton in office, we might see something just like this happen if it were her. And that's not because Donald Trump or not because Hillary, it's because the geopolitics of the matter are pretty much spelling that retrenchment into America and economic protectionism was going to happen no matter what. Now, that's an interesting story that I want more people to understand, so that whenever things like this continue to happen and we keep seeing more frustration and confusion, well, maybe once you see why, it'll start to feel a little bit less worrisome. So understanding why is kind of a big question. So we're going to look at the geopolitics of understanding why the world as it is today explains exactly why these tariffs became real and why they probably would have happened no matter who was in that chair. Okay, to understand so much about American foreign policy, you really need to understand the history of why America acts the way it does, at least the history since World War II. Now, up to World War II, the former world order was mostly maintained through competing old world empires. Now, the period between World War I and World War II saw that collapse to where there was no real order left in the world. And that lack of order is what ultimately caused World War II. Now, following that, you had two powers that remained that completely dominated everything left, mostly because you had the Soviet Union, which had a boundless amount of resources, and you had the United States, which were mostly untouched by World War II relative to the tens of millions of people lost throughout the world. It was pretty clear that these two powers were going to come at loggerheads at some point. So the next half century of world history was dedicated towards finding out which one of these two regimes were going to be on top. The Soviet strategy involved expanding its empire farther and farther into Europe, creating a buffer zone to protect its mostly Russian core. The American strategy was very different. The Americans realized that if they could create an economic powerhouse that would dwarf the Soviets' ability to produce, then they could cause a collapse of the Soviet Union. This happened with the Bretton Woods agreements, a series of diplomatic arrangements that basically set the stage for all international trade to follow after 1944. Now, what was interesting about Bretton Woods is that this happened in the United States at a golf course, actually, and it's one of the most underappreciated moments in world history. But basically what happened is that many diplomats from various parts of the world arrived in the United States around 1944 with the understanding that this was going to be a meeting where the Americans laid out the terms and conditions of the future American world empire. You know, it was clear that the Americans were going to win the war. It was clear that they were going to dictate policy to everyone if we were following the old rules. Now, but what happened instead was that the people who put on Bretton Woods had a very different idea for what the post-World War II world would look like. Instead, they said, look, this is what's going to happen. Everyone is going to create a network. We're going to create a network of free trade to where everyone involved can trade anything with everyone else. It's not going to cost you anything, and we're even going to defend everyone doing it. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. This was saying that if you're a member of this agreement, that say you're France and Brazil and South Africa or Australia, that you could trade any good you wish with any of those countries, and you wouldn't have to do the necessary work of defending those countries. You wouldn't have to defend what lay in between those countries, namely large oceans that could be raided, or your ships could be sunk, or dealing with pirates. Anything that you wanted to trade, you could trade. Now, this was monumental. Nothing like that had ever happened. Before that, you had actual empires doing this, and you would have something like the British Empire, which would create its colonies and take over various parts of the world, and it would trade in between the colonies. So you would have inter-colony trade, but you wouldn't have trade, say, between the major empires themselves. Because if you knew that you might go to war with, say, the German Empire or the French or the Italian Empire, then you're not going to set up a lot of major trade relationships. But now the Americans were saying, look, everyone trades with everyone. What that allowed, that it had never been allowed before, was somebody in Brazil to dig up raw material and to seek customers anywhere in the world, not just with their imperial dictates, but anyone in the world who could use that raw material. And anybody in the world could take that raw material and turn it into something else. And they could seek some customer anywhere else in the world who could take that something and turn it into something more advanced. What that eventually led is that whoever was best off in the system could take advantage of all this wealth being created everywhere in the world and have that to make themselves wealthier. Now, what this eventually did was that it created wealth everywhere in the world. It was the proof of concept for capitalism everywhere in the world. But you know what? It wasn't about making the world better off. What this was creating a vast empire with no one in charge of it. No one was in charge. The Americans did not actually tell anyone else what to do. But through self-interest, everyone in the planet became wealthier by trading with everyone else. Now, the reason that this benefited the Americans was, again, because we're focused not just on getting wealthy, but on beating the Soviets. This was a competition between American philosophy and Soviet philosophy. Now, Soviet philosophy was to focus on building an actual old world type empire that would protect themselves. The Americans, however, wanted to make it so beneficial to be part of this wealth building network that no one wanted to be a part of a Soviet empire. And that worked in that every time we saw an experiment where we saw the American way versus the Soviet way, capitalism versus communism, say East and West Germany or North and South Korea, we saw untold suffering in anyone who tried the communist way of life. We saw untold prosperity in anyone who tried to be part of this global network. Now, keep doing this for several decades. Keep doing this for several decades, and you see the Americans investing heavily in the military because their goal isn't just to win a war against a country. Their goal is to provide security for this economic environment throughout the entire planet. You see, that's why the United States military is so vastly more powerful than any other military in the world. It isn't that we're trying to beat any one other nation. It's that we're trying to ensure that we can provide security to the entire planet. We have to be able to be involved in at least 2 major military engagements and as many as 5 small events that could be taking place. So people who talk about America World Police, yes, it's our military isn't meant so much for defense as much as ensuring the defense of the planet and ensuring that we can provide some level of stability. And you might laugh at that, the idea of the American military is to provide stability, mostly by looking at things like Afghanistan or Iraq or Korea or any time that they're actually involved. But if you look at the broader picture, any objective measurement of the world since 1940 will show that since America has taken on this global cop mentality, but if you look at any objective measurement of what the world is like since the United States took on this global cop role, you'll see that battle deaths and violent deaths have dramatically declined. World health has gone up. Wealth and prosperity have gone up throughout the world. Any objective measurement that could be used to define quality of life has gone dramatically up since this has happened. And to do that, you need somebody who will police the global commons, being the United States military, namely the U.S. Navy. Now, again, to illustrate that point, that the United States military isn't just about beating any particular military on the planet, but to ensure global security throughout the planet, this is a really good tool to see that. This is an image depicting every aircraft carrier in the world. Now, the aircraft carrier is the way that nations project power, which is saying that this is how they respond to events such as a war, such as a conflict, that need to be handled through militaristic means rather than when diplomacy or trade fail. Okay, an aircraft carrier is how you make sure that gets done. Your nation's will gets a say, gets a vote in that matter. Okay, if you don't have an aircraft carrier, you can't be part of a military solution in the modern world. Now, this image shows every aircraft carrier in the world. And as you can see, the blue box is just America's proportion of it. Now, this image is a bit outdated. It's from 2014. It does feature a couple of new additions, but it's still mostly accurate for today. Okay, this shows just how much the other nations are dwarfed by the United States Navy. That's because the Navy's job is to ensure that trade goes through not just for trade dealing with the United States, but that the entire network is secure. Here's another way of looking at that, to where you can see exactly how much of all the aircraft carriers in the world are United States aircraft carriers, but it goes even deeper than that. This is what it looks like when you also include all of the United States allies within NATO. So when you include for the allies, you can see that all the forces that are trying to keep and preserve this world order, namely those that were developing against the Soviet Union, completely overtake anything else provided against it. But there's more. And this image is what you see when you also include all of America's close allies throughout the world. And this is everybody else. This is all of the aircraft carriers of the world who we wouldn't consider close allies of the United States. But there's an even better way to look at that, and that's in looking at a measurement of super aircraft carriers. A super aircraft carrier is a sort of unofficial distinction that talks about the difference between some types of aircraft carriers and the others. Now, here in the middle is what is called a super aircraft carrier. This single ship is basically a floating airbase. It can project power throughout the world. But if you'll see, that ship is not the only one there. Anytime that an aircraft carrier goes out, it goes out with an attachment of many other ships. This is a battle group. This is a aircraft carrier battle group. And included in it are various destroyers, our missile ships, anti-submarine warfare ships, replenishment ships, some of the destroyers that specialize in nothing but anti-aircraft, not to mention marine detachments. In this image, you're literally seeing more firepower than is commanded by most nations on Earth. So their ability to change the diplomatic atmosphere is unquestionable. And that's why most presidents, whenever there's a major situation, they say, where's the nearest carrier? And they're not referring to just any regular carrier. They're referring to these super aircraft carriers and their battle groups. Now, when you try to account for the power of a navy based on super aircraft carriers, it turns into an even more lopsided affair in favor of the Americans. Now, remember that a super aircraft carrier is more than just the power of one boat. It is a super ship that travels with many other ships that, working together, have the capacity to change the map of the world. Now, looking at all the super aircraft carriers of the world, you see exactly how lopsided this battle is in favor of the Americans. This becomes even more true when you look at their allies. And when you factor in everybody else, you see that there truly is no competition. So what does any of this have to do with today? Well, quite honestly, nothing, and that's the point. You see, all of this from the massive United States military, namely its Navy, its very, very, very expensive Navy, as well as all of the allies building up support. This was all a means to create an economic environment that would outproduce the Soviet Union. Okay, that was the goal. That was the entire goal of this, was to create a world economy that would crumble the Soviet Union. Well, guess what? We won. It worked. The Soviet Union collapsed in the 80s, leaving the 90s for America to basically live in a golden age all the way up until about 2001. But during that entire time, we were left really asking the question of, well, what do we do now? America had no reason to support the world in creating this economic environment, even though it benefited everybody else. Now, we could say that that alone was good enough, that as long as everybody's getting richer, why not keep going? But here was the problem. This really works for America in that we can afford to finance everyone's security only when everybody else is poor. Now, it helps us a lot that everybody else is getting richer. It really does. But as that wealth gap between America and the rest diminishes, then you should start to expect to see more help in ensuring that the security that it takes to keep everybody so rich and wealthy would be split among everybody else. But the problem is that we haven't. If you look at places like the EU and NATO nations, there was an obligation written into the agreement that they would spend as much as 2% of their GDP on defense every year. I can understand why they won't. They no longer fear a sense of existential crisis by having the Soviet Union at their gates. Russia, as bad as it is in the news today, it's nowhere near what the Soviet Union used to be as far as an international force of terror. But by not making their obligations, it puts more strain on the Americans. And whenever the Americans view that it's their responsibility, their job to intervene in wars across the world, we also expect that our allies will be there as well. Now, whether you agree with wars like Afghanistan or Iraq, most of the world community showed that they weren't willing to support us when we did go into an action. Again, this is not a debate about whether they should have agreed or not. It's a debate about the fact that the economies of the world are buttressed by American military might, but whenever the American military intervenes, they're not receiving the aid that they expect. You also look at organizations like the United Nations, which are funded at least 25% by American tax dollars, routinely voting against American interests. From the American perspective, this is a sour deal. Americans are seeing that they're basically financing the wealth of the rest of the world to pull themselves out of poverty only through American sacrifice of both blood and treasure. Now, from the American perspective, why would they do that? Well, the only good reason that an American would say to do that is if, in maintaining this network, they get access to things that they otherwise couldn't. Take those raw materials that happen in places like Brazil or Africa. If the Americans can't get access to those raw materials, then it's in their interest to preserve a relationship with those places so that they have access to them. This was actually the justification for why empires happened in the first place. But here's the deal. America is a very unique nation. They have access to almost every raw good imaginable just within the continental United States. They don't need to be anywhere else in the world to get access to almost anything they could want. Now, it might not be as cheap as you would find it in some other places, mostly because labor costs are so low, mostly because education rates are so low, mostly because they're not dealing with first world nations. But as the wealth gap narrows, all those costs are going up, and we're starting to see it level off. Now, again, we have to remember, the United States military is what ensures that this can happen. But only the United States military is the one that's being used. But as much as many Americans wanted to pull back to just the United States and rely on just the United States resource wealth to live off while the rest of the world took care of themselves, America couldn't. They would suffer a massive hit to their living standard if they were to try something like that. America was still stuck with the reality that they had to be part of this global network because we still needed the global network more than we could give it up. The price of oil and the price of labor still were incredibly important in determining global geopolitics. So that meant that America still would be embroiled in international conflicts and ensuring some level of peace to ensure that the cheap labor could be found overseas and to ensure that global energy prices stayed somewhere near reasonable. Now, this is true with energy. Now, if you want to say that the Americans only fought for oil, then you're going to have to deal with the fact that most Iraqi oil went to China. This is further proof that America ensured the global network more than they just pillaged to take everything for themselves. Okay, but America still had a huge stake in ensuring the global energy prices stayed about the same. Okay, they still had a stake to make sure the global labor market stayed the same. So as much as many people would have liked to have seen an America First policy years ago, it could never have been done. This all changed in the early 2010s. At that point, a few new inventions came out that radically changed the future of American politics. Those series of innovations were in two key industries. One was shale oil. Shale oil is a different process for pulling oil out of the ground. It's too complex for me to go into now, but it basically made it to where American oil reserves went through the roof. And we can now extract oil more cheaply than we'd ever been able to, and capture oil that was out of reach for us for years. This meant that the United States, which had been traditionally a net oil importer, bringing oil in from overseas, would be on track to be a net oil exporter by the 2020. We would be energy independent for the first time in decades. This was a massive change in the way that we viewed the world. We no longer had a reason to be embroiled in Middle Eastern politics. We no longer had a reason to care about global energy prices because we now could rely on our own sources of energy. Okay, that was huge. That was a huge upset. The second major set of innovations was 3D printing. Now, 3D printing hasn't hit what it will, but because of 3D printing, it's now possible to replace the cheap labor of nations like China. It's now possible to replace them with a machine that can pump out many, many, many simply made items in an hour that's actually in your office, over in your factory, that can do the work without needing to deal with the transport costs, without needing to deal with the logistics. Now, in America, robotics have the means to replace cheap labor from overseas. So those two key factors that kept America embroiled in international politics, cheap labor and cheap oil, are now also part of the American system. Okay, that only started in the early 2010s, and it didn't actually really start hitting effect, more with shale oil, until close to the end of the Obama administration. Even back as far as 2004, we saw this starting. Okay, we started seeing the retrenchment of the United States, pulling back into its own because it no longer was profitable for the Americans to be there for the rest of the planet. Now that the Soviet Union is gone and the world no longer faces the existential threat of communism, there really isn't a reason for the United States to need to intervene anywhere else. The very loud outcry from the rest of the world who makes it clear that they don't want us involved anyway doesn't help either. So by the time that Trump came in, the world was set up to have an American policy of complete retrenchment, of saying, you know what, let's just focus on us. Let's pull back all the troops. Let's pull back all the resources. Let the world take care of the world's problems because we can take care of ourselves. And that's why Make America Great Again and America First were not nationalistic motivations that Donald Trump cooked up in some sort of propaganda machine. Now, it worked because it actually did spell out a policy that reflects the reality of the world we live in. America no longer has many reasons to be involved overseas. We can take care of most issues on our own. Now, this can't be understated enough. It doesn't matter who would have been in office. It wouldn't have mattered if it was Donald Trump or if it was Hillary Clinton. That reality would still be true. And the Americans would not have a good reason for being involved with the world politics as much as they are today. We would still be seeing retrenchment, falling back into the United States to focus on the needs of only the people of the United States, no matter who was in office. This is a global reality that goes much deeper than partisan politics. So what does this mean for Americans going forward? It means that things like tariffs we'll probably start seeing more because Americans are going to be incentivized to building up our own resources, being our own manufacturing, our own production of goods, our own production of raw supplies. It's going to be in American interest to build those up, as other nations aren't going to be viewed as important to the American strategy anymore. We're also going to see more conflicts across the world as the main guarantor of security is no longer going to be present. We're also going to see many of the nations that are doing better than others trying to create a regional atmosphere to where they can control the trade within their little region. Now, what this is going to look like, it's going to look very much like the old empires that existed during the 1800s, where people across the world are trying to create trade networks that they can control. Now, just like that, you're going to have very difficult environments where it's hard to trade between the networks. What that'll look like in the long run is that this era of profound wealth generation throughout the world is going to lose most of the energy that made it so profoundly good for so many people. It's going to come, if not to a stop, then it's going to slow to a crawl. For some nations, that'll be disastrous. For others, it'll just be stagnation. Now, here in the United States, we're going to do okay. We're going to be able to leverage off of the resources we have. We're not going to see the types of profound wealth building that we've had for the last 30 years, or for the last 70 years for that matter. But we're going to continue to progress where much of the rest of the world, if they don't come up with some system on their own, some networks that are extraordinarily powerful on their own, they're not going to be able to do it. And this will be how the world works until something big happens. Now, hopefully that something big isn't something terrible, like what brought America out of its last isolationist period. But in my mind, I don't know what that could be. Now, I don't want to make that sound hyperbolic, like we're doomed to repeat these massive world wars of the past. I don't know if it'll be anything like that. I'm just saying that we're going to see a time where America is not involved. And being that America has, for the past 70 years, been basically the force that caused so much of the wealth creation, they're not going to be there. And in all likelihood, it's going to become harder for those nations that have been prospering under that to find the same prosperity that they had before. All that I want to leave you with is the tariffs, what we're seeing with the tariffs, they're not something that should surprise anyone. They're something that is a completely natural outgrowth of what geopolitics could have predicted at least since 2012. They're something that we should expect, and that we should expect more of. We're going to see more trade wars. We're going to see more actual wars, starting off with small wars that America is just not involved with. Even maybe some larger wars that America tries very hard to avoid. We're going to see less and less involvement in the United States going forward. The fact that we're seeing a lot of good news out of North Korea, a lot of good news out of Syria, that's great, but we might not see so much here in the future, and that's something that Americans and the rest of the people of the world need to not be so surprised about whenever news of it comes, and just realize that is the new reality moving forward for at least many decades to come. Okay, so there was a lot in that last segment. Maybe you agree, maybe you disagree, maybe you think that I'm completely off in my belief that America will be okay leaving the rest of the world. Maybe you think this idea of American retrenchment is completely bogus. I want to hear from you guys. Do you think that this is actually a good explanation for what's happening in the world? Or do you think that this is a completely bogus theory that I've got, and you think that you got something better? I'm curious as to find out what you guys think. So if you guys think that I was totally off, go ahead and leave it in the comments. But I want to hear some discussion from you guys and some feedback. So leave your comments at the bottom. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you later on another episode of War Elephants Past in Review. Again, my name is John Davis. This has been War Elephants Past in Review. Thank you very much. Semper Fi, and God bless. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to help me make more future episodes, please show your support by visiting the Patreon link provided. I am deeply grateful for all the support that you help me provide. It helps make everything I do possible. As always, thank you for joining us today on War Elephants Past in Review. I killed down low, want to sweep for champions. I can't believe it's right.